Way back in 1989, a guy named Rivers Cuomo decided to move to California with his band Zoom. Pretty much as soon as they moved there as a band, they broke up before doing anything. Later on, he met two people that would help start up his next band, Matt Sharp and Pat Wilson. Again, not long after, they came up with the name Weezer, which was a nickname he got from his asthma, as well as the name they gained their final member, Jason Cropper. Then, in November of 1992, they released their first album of demos called The Kitchen Tape. With these demos, they got a record deal with Geffen Records. But now there was a new problem. Jason would leave right before the album was finished, so they had to bring on Brian Bell as a quick replacement, and Rivers re-recorded all of Jason's parts. Then they released their first self-titled album, Weezer, more known as the Blue Album. The album was an amazing success. It even reached triple platinum status, selling over 3.5 million copies. Everyone in the band was extremely happy about this except for Rivers. He didn't like all the attention that the band was getting. He would look like his soul is like leaving his body in every interview at the time. After all the stress was put onto him like a ton of bowling balls, he started going to Harvard for classical composition. Right after he got accepted, he got a surgery to correct his right leg so his legs were the same length. This made him way more isolated because he was stuck in his dorm room healing, which inspired him to write a song called The Good Life on their next album, Pinkerton. Pinkerton is very messy yet authentic, mostly because they decided that they would self-produce the album. Also, with Rivers' depression, this album is a lot darker, and when Pinkerton released it, heavily underperformed because most radio stations and MTV would not allow it to be on the air. After Pinkerton released, most people that heard it didn't really like it. Even Rolling Stone voted it top 3 worst albums of the year. It was just too different from their first album. With a semi-successful tour, they announced a hiatus. Rivers made a new band called Homie to test out new songs that he was making. But with this hiatus, and Matt Sharp feeling like he couldn't contribute enough to the band, he left Weezer to focus more on his own band called The Rentals. Right before they got back together to create a new album, they got a bassist called Mikey Welsh and made an EP called Christmas with Weezer, and then they finally made the Green Album. The Green Album is a lot like their first album, but much more shallow. Right after they created the music video for Island in the Sun, Mikey Welsh was hospitalized for unknown reasons, so they brought in Scott Schreiner, who is still the Weezer bassist to this day. Immediately after they brought Schreiner into the band, they started working on Maladroit by getting a lot of fan input by putting demos on the message boards. It started off well, but then Rivers started acting like a 4-year-old when everyone was saying that these songs weren't as good as the Blue Album, and like pretending to be a teenager and saying these false stories about his brother making fun of him. It's very weird. But when the album came out, it sold horribly. The singles did perform better than Pinkerton, but this was their worst selling album yet. After all the frustration he had towards his fans and the album not really doing that great in general, he became extremely depressed. Now, when writing for their next album, Make Believe, they tried to do the same thing that they did with Maladroit by posting them online, but they were mostly based on electronic music and synthesizers, and fans kind of hated that, so they just gave up on the online things. After writing a few more songs, Rivers had a total lifestyle change thanks to Rick Rubin, who produced the album. Rubin gave him a book called The Gift, which is a book full of love songs to God. Rivers is an atheist though, but he still found a way to connect it with the book. And with Rivers also starting to do meditation, he was feeling a lot better about his life. Then he went back to college, pretty much sold everything he owned, and volunteered pretty much daily. Now it's 2004 and Rivers is continuing on working on the album. But this is a big problem because Rivers did all this work when he was super depressed and hating his life, and now he's writing the rest of the songs during the happiest time of his life. So now he's got to put 2 polar opposite songs in the same album. Plus, the only big hit on this album wasn't even good. It was about how Rivers really wanted to live in Beverly Hills, even though he lived only 20 minutes away. This was the first album that people actually had reasons to hate Weezer. More specifically, Pitchfork, who gave the album a 0.4 out of 10. The Red Album. The Red Album was released after he graduated college and he was now married. He was also way more experimental than the album, which was usually a strong suit for like half the songs, but for the other half it was kind of iffy. Unlike Ratitude, where it took risks and completely failed. In 2009, Weezer released Gratitude. It is easily their most universally hated album. First off, they had a new drummer join, so Rivers didn't have to hold a guitar and Pat could just play for him. And this is also when Weezer tried to go pop, and failed miserably. It also has some of the weirdest lyric choices I've ever heard, like... And that's on a song called I'm Your Daddy. The only genuine thing about this album was when he got into a car crash. In December, during the tour bus that he was in skidded on some black ice. Rivers got extremely hurt during this, but after the tour they made their next album, Hurley. The new album that they were making, Hurley, there was actually no one really there to document it, so we don't really know much about this album. But they did have YouTubers like Fred and Annoying Orange doing advertisement. Oh my God, it's Weezer! This wasn't really the reputation saver that they needed, but you know what was? The Weezer Cruise. Yes, Weezer was actually on a boat. It even directly inspired their reputation-saving album. Everything Will Be Alright in the End, which I'm just gonna call it UBAIT because, you know, acronyms are cooler. So they got rid of the new drummer and put Pat back on drums, and Rivers had to hold a guitar again? Man, this album's gonna be suck. This album goes super in depth, but the only part that matters right now is it was kind of an autobiography for Rivers to sing through. Since they gave the album time to breathe, it was a lot more articulated than anything in the 2000s, and it kind of saved Weezer's reputation. Right after they released UBAIT, they actually started working on their next album, the White Album, pretty much immediately after. And with this album, Rivers and the producer were fighting over the certain sound that they wanted, either between Pinkerton and Gratitude. The producer won, and they had another good album. When the album was released, it wasn't like Make Believe, where it was an awful mix of tracks trying to sound extremely depressing and super happy at the same time, and then coming out like fake 5th grader emo. They used the opportunity of having their fans' good graces back and just soared. And then one day, this random Ohioan teen went out to Twitter and begged Weezer to do a cover of Africa. After they eventually did it, they saw a very easy album opportunity and did a covers album. But then the long-awaited Black Album came out, which was going to be the opposite version of White. It has been hyped up ever since White came out, and everyone was super excited to hear a sound that was like White and 90s Weezer. All they actually really got was synthetic pop and a lot of swear words. So after that letdown, they announced their Hella Mega Tour that they were going to be doing with Green Day and Fall Out Boy. It got pushed back because it was slated for May 2020 and there was kind of a coronavirus. So instead of their Kind of Metal album coming out, they released OK Human. Remember when Rivers went to college?
Nope.
Yeah, me neither. But basically, this was an orchestral album that related to what he did in college. This was always meant to be more retrospective than the normal Weezer album, but with all the 2020 corona stuff and everything else that was happening, it had a much more somber tone throughout the entire album. But I want to talk about one specific song, Grapes of Wrath, which is about Rivers' love for books and how they kept him sane through isolation. And also, he talks about Audible in 1984.
Count on me to show support for Winston Smith in 1984. 'Cause battling Big Brother feels more meaningful than binging zombie hordes.
And it was another album that was held in high regard in the same place as White and UBAIT by being good. And right after that, they released Van Weezer, which kind of turned into a tribute album to Eddie Van Halen, who died shortly before it released. But it was also so they would have music for the Hella Mega Tour. It surprisingly sold pretty well, but all the reviews were just always really mediocre. And yeah, thank you for your time.